Welcome to today's 3-Minute Halacha. The Gemara in Brachot on 40a quotes Rava, teaching that a person is not allowed to eat bread unless if they bring melach oliftan, salt or a kind of food they would dip the bread into before everyone's seated at the table. It's based on this that we have the principle that a person should not make a motzi unless if there is salt to be able to dip the bread into. And this is the halacha that is taught in the Shulchan Aruch in chapter 167, paragraph 5. And yet, right afterwards, we learn also that Rava once ate bread without salt. And when he was questioned, he answered, Let dein sarich beshash. This doesn't need beshash. The Aruch explains that there are three possible explanations. That bashash may be a kind of relish in which they would normally dip the bread. And Rava's answer was that only bread that would require a dip or would normally be dipped would require salt, but this bread was being eaten all by itself, and therefore there was no need to have salt at the table. The Rosh says that this opinion is the explanation of the Gemara. However, there are two other explanations. One is bashash means to wait, that someone who didn't have salt doesn't have to wait to eat bread, but they could eat the bread without the salt. And the third explanation, the one that is adapted by the Ra'am, is that this kind of bread doesn't require salt, or as the Ra'ah teaches, that if it is a finer quality of bread that is eaten without any kind of salt, you don't have to salt the bread. Ultimately, in the Shulchan Aruch, we learn that the idea of putting salt on a bread is not an obligation, but it was something they would do to add flavor to the inferior kinds of bread they would normally eat. And nowadays, since the bread that we have has salt as part of even the kneading process, and it has the finest of flours, there isn't an obligation to add salt to your bread when you're going to eat it, and that's the halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. Nevertheless, the Ramah does point out that there's a secondary reason not to put salt on your bread, but to have salt at the table. And that is because a table reminds us of the altar of the Mizbeach. And every offering on the Mizbeach, every korban had salt, and therefore we put salt on the table. Based on this, we find the custom among many people that when it comes to Shabbat or other times, they always dip their bread in salt or put salt on the bread. However, al pi halacha, it's not necessary. Not too long ago, Rav Shechter was eating at our home for Shabbat. In our home, we don't have the custom to salt the bread, a custom that I learned from my grandfather. And yet I always see everyone else putting salt on bread. And I asked Rav Shechter to make the bracha of the Motzi. And he ate the bread without salting it. And I asked Rav Shechter, why is that the case? And he said, my wife's bread, my challah, is always tasty. I don't need to have the salt. In other words, Rav Shechter agreed with the position of the Ra'ah, the key position of the Shulchan Aruch, that you don't need to put salt on bread that's made either from a good flour or has the salt already in when it's being kneaded and prepared.